Who are the terrorists? Dear Lily, there are many secret organizations dedicated to undermining the state. These are often classified as rebel or terrorist movements. The main point here is the obvious one, that one person's freedom fighter is another's terrorist. To some, Chechens, Karens in Burma, Catholic Irish, Basques, Kurds, Nagas, Palestinians, Tamil Tigers, their dreams and hopes for independence seem attainable only through organized violence against what they consider to be an overbearing state. They believe they are fighting for their freedom and dignity. Yet, to those in power in the state, they are terrorists. It is, of course, mainly a question of perspective. We can see this easily enough by the way in which terrorists become non-terrorists once they achieve their goals. When they become the Israeli state, Maoist China, or ANC-led South Africa, the terrorist label is discreetly forgotten. Nelson Mandela is a good example of the transition from supposed terrorist to national hero. There seem to be a growing number of these organizations. This partly reflects access to weapons and explosives, partly increasing wealth. They often center on the lines that have been drawn across the world by colonial powers. The borders between states, mainly set out in the 19th century, which cross-cut or ignore ethnic groups such as the Kurds, Basques, Nagas, Tamils, many African groups, are often felt to impose apparently arbitrary and alien rule upon them. What seems to be at the root of this widespread problem is the lack of strategies to make people free but united. The idea of an international umbrella under which almost sovereign states could carry on their lives according to their own wishes and customs seems very difficult to achieve. The bloody history of resistance and terrorism over the last century could have led to a two-tier model in which certain functions necessary for co-working at a high level were done by an overarching state, but everything else was devolved. This is the model, for example, some hope that the European Union will achieve. Yet it appears very difficult to manage. Almost every large nation faces the draining effects of local terrorism or resistance in the absence of such a satisfactory legal umbrella. What seems relatively new is the spread of these organizations around the world. The new types of terror are international, a coalescing of some of those groups and the emergence of others. This has led into the so-called war on terror or war on terrorism. In fact, however, there is nothing particularly new about such a war. Why do people feel menaced? Those in power usually feel under threat. At one time it was the Jews who were rumoured to form an international conspiracy to undermine Christian values. They were believed to eat, having sacrificed Christian children, to engage in obscene rituals, and generally to be subversive of all good values. Then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, certain beliefs coming in from Asia were declared to be heretical, and the Cathars or Albigensians in the south of France were destroyed by sword and fire in a giant and ferocious crusade led by the papacy. Then, in the 15th century, an even greater menace was thought to have arisen. Satan, or the devil, emerged to lead a secret assault on civilization with his army of witches. For 200 years, the international conspiracy of evil was thought to consist of witches. Since they were such a threat and could not be detected by normal means, special measures were needed. Manuals were written, legal codes were bent and amended to deal with the new threat. The previous tools to crush heresy, including the Holy Office of the Inquisition, were now used in the war against supposed witches. Thousands were rounded up, tried, convicted, and burnt. So extreme was the fear that even in countries without the Catholic Inquisition and with a different legal system were places where the laws were altered to deal with the new threat. In England, in the 16th century, people who could not normally act as witnesses, children against their parents, a husband against his wife, were permitted to do so in these special circumstances. Previous evidence of behaviour, attitudes and crimes, not normally revealed, could be brought before the court. The individual could be placed under unusual physical and mental pressures in order for evidence to be wrung out. She or he could be deprived of sleep for long periods, supposedly to see whether her familiars, small diabolical pets, came to visit her, but in effect breaking down her resistance. The presumption of innocence was greatly diminished. The necessity for direct proof was waived, and circumstantial or spectral, that is, hazy spiritual evidence was allowed. In the end, faced with universal fear and loathing, shunned by their friends, told that they were part of a grand conspiracy of satanic covens or cells loosely joined to each other, the poor creatures often confessed and implicated others. They then confirmed that an organization existed whose totally irrational, unjustified and unprovoked aim was to undermine civilization as people knew it. So civilization responded by further abandoning the very justification for its existence. Using the special techniques now allowed, it proved the existence of witches and hanged or burnt them in their thousands. Only much later did doubt set in. It emerged that the whole conspiracy was a delusion created by the legal methods used to attack it. Thousands had been slaughtered on the basis of an illusion. Similar panics still occur. In the 1950s, it was a panic in America about a secret conspiracy of communists that led to the McCarthy trials and the destruction of the reputation and sometimes the lives of many innocent people. Then, in the 1980s, in Britain, a new threat came to light: the so-called paedophile rings. The details of their activities and the widespread sexual abuse of children by their own parents were often recalled when children were counselled by sympathetic experts. Satanic rituals in which children were sexually abused and even human sacrifices were supposed to occur were suddenly believed to be widespread. Hundreds were imprisoned. Thousands of children were taken away from their parents in dawn raids. Only later, as the panic declined, was it discovered that most of the accusations were false, created by the very methods used to try to deal with them. So there are plenty of precedents for the fear of a malevolent other, and all of them tend to involve the shadowy presence of evil, the devil, or Satan. Worldwide conspiracies against civilization were thought to exist for thousands of years. Among them, in their early days, were Christianity and Islam, until they themselves became dominant. What is the axis of evil? There has recently been a rise in the fear of what a president in the United States, George Bush, called the axis of evil. This is a general umbrella term which, like the empire of evil of an earlier president's remark about the Soviet Union, has wider implications once it circulates through the media. The evil is envisaged as a threat to all civilized values. It is believed to threaten the state and all aspects of a society, just as in the past witches or Jews or heretics were thought to menace the foundations of Christian morality. Some think the threat is sufficiently serious to justify the dismantling of the protection for so-called terrorists. A vast conspiracy is feared, and this fear tends to be fueled by the moral panic that is whipped up. This movement appeals to those whose power and prestige are enhanced. They may, as with the great witch hunters of the past, feel a glow of satisfaction and passionately believe that they are protecting their God and their country. Looking back after the event, we may well come to feel the same about the current panic as we now do about witch hunting. People may conclude that the action of the state in countering terrorism is undermining the very values it claims to protect. Beliefs in Satan witches, and the axis of evil are a perpetual, irrefutable justification for sweeping countermeasures. We are used to the temporary and drastic suspension of normal legal protections and processes during a limited war. In the Second World War, for example, suspected aliens were rounded up and imprisoned without trial. All citizens immediately lost many of their rights. Freedom of speech was severely curtailed. Loyalty to the state became paramount. Serious criticism was discouraged as being close to treason. If you are not for us, you are against us, it was argued. The state was justified in bullying, lying, deceiving, swooping down, spying on anyone. Truth is said to be the first casualty of war. The freedom and rights of individuals are the second. Afterwards, there may be apologies, as there were, for example, to the large numbers of innocent Japanese rounded up and locked away in America after Pearl Harbor. But that is afterwards. War itself usually spells an end to liberty and equality before the law. Yet wars, at least the typical wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, had one compensation. They tend to be bounded in time. There was a period of war, and civil liberties and the normal processes of law were suspended. But then there was peace, and the luxury of freedom could again be afforded by the state, and was demanded by a citizenry who had not forgotten their earlier freedoms. People even persuaded themselves that this is what they had been fighting for, even if temporarily they had had to abandon their rights and freedoms. The axis of evil, whether Al-Qaeda or the satanic cults of witches, is rather different. This is a world linked to certain tendencies within Christianity and Islam. Those involved on both sides of the struggle believe that there is someone out there who is trying to undermine their way of life, and whose motives they cannot fathom. These unseen folk are evil with a capital E. Whether they are feared Western capitalists or Islamic fundamentalists, they are believed by many to be in league with the devil. The defenders of our way of life believe that evil never sleeps. It is always plotting, always invisible, irrationally consumed with a desire to destroy our rational, sane, orderly, pleasant way of life. It seeks menacingly, reds under the beds, as the communists were once described, or, to use a more modern metaphor, the monster hiding in the wardrobe of the frightened child in Monsters, Inc. Just as in the past, witches were thought to hide behind the outward smile of neighbours, terrorists are believed by some to conceal themselves as students in our universities. Evil will use any weapons of single or mass destruction, curses, the poisoning of wells, a well-known technique ascribed to witches and Jews in the past, pestilences, biological warfare against animals and humans, and plagues of caterpillars or locusts. There may be temporary victories against the evil forces, but there can be no truce or termination. We must fight continuously, for evil is hydra-headed. Cut off one of its manifestations, for instance the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it will spring up again somewhere else. Worst of all, it is not just an external threat, as are conventional enemies, the Germans, the French, the British, or whoever we are fighting against in the wars between nation-states. The minions of the evil one are in our midst, or so it is alleged. We are told that terrorism feeds on envy, the envy of poor immigrants for their hosts, or of impoverished people in the developing world who cannot accept that the fact that they earn 1/100th of what a Westerner in many affluent societies earns is perfectly fair. The poison lurks in the devious practices of people who eat strange foods, not as was supposed with Jews and witches in the past, babies and other sacrificial victims, but highly spiced and strange substances, or rubbishy fast food, who go through strange rituals, not satanic ones, but worshipping Allah or other gods, who wear too few clothes, miniskirts, or too many veils. Of course, there are differences between earlier panics and the present one. Witches, we know, could not actually harm people. A bomb delivered by whichever side in the battle kills and maims. The main point, however, is to realize from past experience that it is very easy to get into an almost unending, vicious cycle of fear. We would do well to remember a line from Edwin Muir's poem. We have seen good men made evil, wrangling with the evil, straight minds grown crooked, fighting crooked minds. Can the struggle against evil ever end? The fight against evil continues. The elimination of terrorism, as in the past, witchcraft, is the goal. We are told that it is a war we must win. Yet a moment's thought will show that such a goal forever recedes before us. In a world so blatantly unjust, where some consume 3/4 of the world's resources, while the rest live indebted and enslaved, how can those who wish us ill be eliminated? Witches in the past were blamed for the envy they understandably felt for those who denied them help. The guilt felt by the better off was reflected back, and uncharitable behaviour became justified because it was against a witch. So nowadays a rich Westerner or Asian can blame fanatics for being potential suicide bombers. They can be angry at asylum seekers for foolishly getting themselves born in a country where no economic living can be made, or where torture is widespread. A war on terrorism, along with the endless battle, paranoia, aggression and undermining of civil liberties that it justifies, inevitably feeds the power of the state. It's easy to see how swiftly we can move towards the world portrayed by George Orwell in 1984, with a seemingly benevolent Big Brother telling us that one more effort, one more, temporary of course, erosion of our privacy, dignity, freedom, or wealth will finally eliminate the evil one. Just one more invasion to root out the contagion, to drain the swamps, to eradicate the vermin, to crush and destroy, and then we would have won. All the metaphors are taken from the constant human battle to destroy weeds, vermin, pests, wild animals. That has been classified as unworthy of respect or understanding. They are metaphors that were used in the medieval battle against Satan and his witches, and they are the ones used again today. If we make this last effort, the nightmare will be over. The foreign bodies that infect our world will be eliminated, and utopia will be ushered in. For some, this means eliminating the insidious poison of consumer capitalism. For others, the nightmare of closed and illiberal religious fanaticism. Both dreams are unrealistic in our interconnected world. The masses will not give up the hope of living in a rich industrial society, nor will we be able to stop them hating us, to persuade them to thank us for our civilized ability to soak up the world's wealth. The best we can do is to control our level of fear. I agree with the great American President, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Let me affirm my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.